So, I've been listening to a lot of Korean music lately. And I figured I would talk about it. Well, that's the short version of it anyway. Over time, I had been pretty naturally finding and listening to a handful of artists. But my interest was piqued further when I looked at those albums I had found and realized that all of them were from the 2000s or later, even besides all the huge idol groups that everyone knows about now. And then I thought about the other category of Korean media that I've engaged with even more, which is film. If you've explored their cinema a bit and try to think about who the most notable directors are, odds are fair that you're coming up with Park Chan-wook, Bong Joon-ho, Lee Chang-dong, Kim Ji-won, the whole gang. And again, their work ranges from now to the 90s at the earliest. Films prior to then I rarely hear about. Even though nowadays we have the luxury of so much old cinema being easily accessible, not much there is being pulled out and rediscovered by new audiences. So when you notice that consistency, clearly there's a reason for that. There's a story here. There were past complications to this culture that, strangely enough, me pretty much only knowing that a Korean war occurred at some point doesn't fully sum up. And that was when I was motivated to more actively search through a large spread of Korea's music, to basically use a country's art as a window into its history, as you see how it was affected by and adapted to the changing circumstances decade after decade. So that's all I'm doing here, looking through a window. Though before that I want to establish a few things. Firstly, in regards to this video and its title, I am not meaning to personally or condescendingly dismiss K-pop as a genre. Like, yeah, it isn't what I listen to much. I'm not a big pop or idol person in general, but, I thought Talk That Talk by Twice was catchy as hell. I listened to a BTS album and thought it was solid. My sister showed me the Baggy Jeans video, and I like that they repeat the word baggy so many times that they can't do it in a single breath. Baggy, 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 baggy jeans. Baggy, 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 baggy jeans. I'm not against it. The reason why I'm not going to focus on it much is more so just that there's absolutely no shortage of people who are doing exactly that, and those people are both way more passionate and more knowledgeable on that topic than I am. So frankly, I would have little to add. It's very obviously a dominant category when it comes to Korean music, which is fine. I would just much rather discuss what isn't nearly as out in front from a modern outside point of view. Also, K-pop fans scare me. Secondly, as always, this isn't a definitive or comprehensive history. I'm just someone who is curious and interested. I'm not claiming to be an expert, especially since it's pretty frickin' difficult to become an expert on this topic if you don't speak Korean. Like when I did the video on Japanese music, I talked about how it took a surprising amount of effort to fully sink my teeth into that topic and find a lot of connecting points. But now, that was a cakewalk compared to Korean music. It already has its own greater complications due to the country's general history that I'll get into, but also, informative sources are fewer and far between, the general preservation of old media wasn't as tight, a lot of films were lost or almost lost forever. So with music, there are some holes with rare records that you won't be able to find online. And even the stuff that is online sometimes isn't organized that well. So finding all the songs on an album is a task itself. At one point, I was trying to find the third album from this decently notable folk artist named Yang-hyun, which isn't a forgettable one. It's one of her more highly regarded records and is mentioned as one of the first in the psychedelic folk genre. But in order to find a place where the songs from it were all organized in one spot, I had to scrounge around until I ended up at whatever the hell this website that I've never heard of before is. And that's not the only issue, because apparently, the way the Korean language is romanized into English letters is not consistent, or wasn't always consistent. I would often see J's and CH's being used interchangeably, or U and double O's, or U and EO, stuff like that all over the place. And I already have a tough enough time keeping all the names straight. There are a lot of Kims, okay? But then there's that aspect on top of it, and when I don't even know which way to write it, I gave up on having totally correct pronunciation, alright? Some stuff is just going to be Americanified, okay? Sorry. Also, they would pump out releases so damn much between reissues out of various covers and regular releases, which are sometimes labeled as hit songs or best of, but a lot of those aren't categorized as compilations, and it makes sorting out people's discographies really confusing. When I just want to hear the proper studio records, I'll find myself looking and thinking, wait, is this one a compilation, or is this the record I want, or is this a reissue that looks different, or is that a single? Which one of these am I supposed to be looking for? Like, seriously. There was almost no place safe from frustration. There was even a point where I thought, okay, I'll watch a bit of that popular K-drama, Reply 88, to see what sort of musicians were being shown there as notable in that time period and still remembered fondly now. A simple way to figure out some cultural touchstones. Or so I thought, because for some reason, at least on Netflix, they seem to blur every single goddamn visual piece of media that appears on camera. Posters, album covers, performances on TV, so that we can't see it. Now, you may think that this might be due to some absurd copyright issue that they want to make sure to avoid, but no. Clearly, they just want to hide all this stuff from us. And it's not gonna work. Over the course of the next many months, I found other sources that miraculously were willing to give up the secrets. And I'd like to specifically shout out the ones that were the most useful. First, of the few pretty good books that I read, I will mention the book Made in Korea, which has chapters written by different authors that all come together to paint the broad strokes of the music's history and culture. It was the first one I read, and a pretty solid foundation that's actually part of a series of books like it about different countries, so that's cool. Secondly, there's a blog called Ask a Korean that did a project where the writer went through what they considered to be the 50 most influential artists to Korean pop music in general. And in that, you don't only get the big Mount Rushmore figures, but also the stories of these artists with smaller pockets of influence or who made an impact in less traditional or obvious ways. They don't tie into the big narrative that much, so they wouldn't come up in that first book, for example, but they're like the fun side quests that are still worth knowing. And lastly, with regards to the artists that I'll talk about the most, there was a blog simply called Korean Rock Albums that was very helpful. Seemed to be made by the guy on this channel. And coincidentally, around the time I started digging more into this, a guy on the YouTube channel Mang's Old Vinyl Archive started doing videos talking about 60s and 70s Korean albums one at a time, with English subtitles that he puts in himself. Some of these records I would not have been able to find much information on otherwise, or couldn't tell where exactly they fit into the timeline, so this is very helpful for that particular period. Really cool project that he has there, and he was kind enough to answer a few questions that I had too. If you're curious to look into more after this, those would be easy recommendations. Otherwise, I can probably just start the actual video now. Was there anything else I needed to say? I can't remember if there's... So basically, a large part of both what kept Korea from expanding outward earlier and also limited the backlog of what there is to look back at nowadays was that the country as a whole experienced a lot of starts and stops through the whole 1900s. To sum up almost a whole century in 10 seconds, you've got annexation, poverty, reset, the country split, the Korean War, a dictatorship, release from that, never mind, it's another dictatorship, and then finally a real democracy starting in 1987. These are massive cultural events spread throughout the decades. And in between them all, there wasn't really room to fit in something even remotely similar to the modern Korean wave. Because, like, a tidal wave doesn't appear in the blink of an eye. It needs a lot of space in front of it to move forward and build up. So you can kind of see it growing off in the distance, and you have time to say, oh shit, BTS is heading right towards us, what do we do? Oh my god. That's why, from a Western perspective, the country's footprint in media is largely consolidated to those recent decades where there's been the most stability. However, obviously through all those periods, there were still musicians working within their circumstances. So to go back to the first point on that list, during the period of imperialist Japan, they annexed Korea in the early 1900s. That territory was occupied and Japan controlled the country. And as time went on, that control spread pretty deep. There was a lot of effort to make citizens assimilate to Japanese culture, change their names, basically erase the Korean language as schools put more focus on Japan. In general, a lot of the culture at that point has Japan's hands on it somewhere, among that being Korea's music culture. They ran the radios as well as what few production companies existed as recording technology was becoming available, which I'm sure if this all happened later, that would have been utilized to push Japanese music and general propaganda to a more extreme extent than they were able to at that time. Because as is, the musical seed planted in this period that grew the most seems to be, from my limited view, coming from a more minor and natural influence. Korea's popular music was creating its own new form around this time and ended up absorbing parts from the Japanese genre that was brought over, called enka. You then see overlapping parts of those, like the vocal style, the rustic feel, the pentatonic scale apparently, but like, I don't know, that's music theory stuff and you probably don't care anyways. But the point is that in something that seems a bit more like cultural diffusion than everything else Japan was doing at that point, N.EX.T became not the only influence, but a notable one on what would become Trot. The genre Trot is like if you had to name a Korean music genre that doesn't start with a K and then a dash, this is it. It's fairly ubiquitous. This now old-timey folk genre was initially characterized by the rural vibe, heartfelt lyrics, often sorrowful, depressing mood, frail feeling but well-controlled vocals, and a pretty simple 1-2 rhythm. Like when drums are there, you can pretty much get by with just bass, snare, bass, snare, bass, snare, bass, snare. You know, that sort of thing. Nothing crazy. It's a genre that's had a pretty full life since this point, going from being a young person's game where in the 20s and 30s you had older generations aghast at the fact that these young adults would dare sing songs about like sadness and stuff, to becoming the definitive popular sound for a while, even having decent popularity through the 70s or so when you had singers like Lee Mi-ja, then inevitably being considered to just be old people's hokey music, and falling out of favor until eventually having a rebirth when Jang Yoon-jeong shows up to make Trot with modern polish and an energy that has a bit more pull to it. Like, I was able to appreciate most of the Trot that I found through this process, but her stuff is what I was able to just, enjoy listening to the most. It rarely seemed to fully leave the general public consciousness. Even now, it's not like Blackpink is releasing a full Trot album anytime soon, but it's present. And it's kind of surprising that something that now seems so strongly Korean was formed at a point where their culture was actively being suppressed. But it shows that even under Japanese rule, musicians were naturally working within those confines and not quite being fully absorbed by whatever Japan had already established. Trot becomes its own thing, and even around that, you have Koreans working in jazz, like Kim Hae-sung, who could do practically anything in an orchestral space. Compose, play, sing, conduct, you name it. He was working well in both Korea and Japan, successful enough to the point where he was nearing expanding towards playing in America, and at one point had a concert planned in Hawaii. However, around that point is when you get some of the hiccups that temporarily disrupt what further growth there would be. It stops a small wave. And that disruption basically comes in the form of three things occurring around a similar period. First is the fact that when Japan leaves Korea after being defeated in World War II, they take with them all the production technology and companies that were set up there, leaving not many that were actually owned by Koreans. Now, that's not the biggest deal right away, because the common Korean household didn't have a radio or record player in 1945, so live shows were a bigger focus than recorded music anyways. But still, it's an added limitation, and it'll have ripple effects tying into the country not fully making use of studio recording even when they're more viable. Secondly, because Korea, reasonably so, was unhappy that Japan took over their country in the first place, and with how they were treated by the Japanese in general, that resentment manifested itself in the rejection of anything that's pro-Japanese or was deemed too Japanese-esque. So if a Trot song sounded just a bit too much like N.EX.T, then it'll get criticism and possibly be banned. It's a criteria that at points can be quite nebulous, and I would think unfair too, because at least with instrumentals, if someone likes how a genre sounds, they should be free to take that influence into their own music and not let it be strictly defined by this one thing. Simple as that. But you can see how this ends up happening, and it's the start of a reoccurring thread of censorship throughout Korea's history. Third, after only a handful of years of a reprieve from Japan's rule, there's the Korean War, which, is a war that makes the country fully split the way America and Russia divided it, and I don't need to go into all the nitty-gritty of that, but it's definitely a hell of a lot of instability to deal with. It's a huge change in the culture and has effects beyond the obvious. Like that jazz guy, Kim Hae-sung, whether by choice because he was born in Pyongyang, or because he was kidnapped, he ended up in North Korea and was never heard from again. A very notable figure in music prior to then, suddenly just gone. Needless to say, it's a clearly defined new era for the now South Korea. New circumstances, new evolving government, and new influences as well, with the US troops being stationed there before and after the war. All during a time of extreme evolution of music all over the world as we near the real start of pop music. A ton is happening. So to more easily connect the many steps that occur in the next few decades, I'm going to focus a lot on one particular musician who ties into each of them. And that's a man by the name of Shin Joong-hyun. Certainly one of, but arguably the biggest figure in South Korean music history as a whole. Shin Joong-hyun is a guy where, as much as I often default to it, he's a case where it's clear just how trite always needing to describe a musician as being this country's version of some Western artist really can be. Because if I tried to do that with him, he would be Chuck Berry, he would be Elvis, he would be the Beatles, he would be Phil Spector, minus the bad stuff, he would be Jimi Hendrix. And hell, for good measure, let's just say he'd also be Weezer. He was a self-taught guitarist who engaged with Western music through the radio station run by the American forces there. From hearing the early days of rock and guitar-focused music in general there, that was the type of music he wanted to keep playing. So as a result, he spent a lot of his early career in the 50s and 60s performing in bands at those military bases to entertain the soldiers. A lot of musicians in general would seek out and audition for a job there playing jazz or big band stuff to get paid to perform more consistently and reliably than you would be trying to get gigs elsewhere. And since they generally played the type of music that those American troops wanted to hear, and Americans as we go were more engaged in rock and pop music than the Korean populace, it was especially the case that if you wanted to play rock music yourself, you weren't going to bars and clubs in the city. You were going to a military base. Plenty of notable acts got their start there. For example, early on they were the Kim sisters, who grew to the point of performing on the Ed Sullivan Show many, many times.
When you put your arms around me, I get a feeling that's so hard to. You give me a fever.
An interesting fact on them, they were the daughters and niece of trot musician Lee Na-young and that jazz guy, Kim Hae-song. So they kind of carry the torch of him wanting to perform in America someday, so that's nice. For Shin at the military bases, he basically became a star in that world, cutting his teeth harnessing his skill as a musician while also learning to be more of a showman during performances, from being pushed to do impromptu solos to, apparently since he was short and the band's bassist was very tall, he would slide in between the bassist's legs while still playing the guitar. At points through the 50s and 60s, he's doing around 40 shows per month there. Basically as many as he possibly can, performing these covers of rock and jazz and soul songs. His debut solo album put out in this time likely gives a hint of what those shows sounded like. He displays his thin, slick guitar sound amidst rock, blues, country, with occasional slight jazz feel. Not one of his more talked about albums, but it's pretty solid and the only release he has from this era of his career because then the Beatles happened. Which obviously isn't important whatsoever, but coincidentally, after that, instead of leading a big jazz rock band, Shin shrunk down to a 4-piece group called the Ad 4, who were basically considered to be the first Korean rock band. Since they weren't the only people who had that idea around this time, there were other bands, like Key Boys, who have a very smooth, driving, light rock sound. A little Latin-inspired too, I think. But the Ad 4 got the title of first rock band. And from there, being the ones at the head of that new rising wave for that genre, the sound that would eventually take over the whole world, they went on to break up. They broke up. They made a few albums and didn't sell too well, so they broke up pretty quickly. Rock music overall was still just not gonna make hits in Korea. For general audiences, rock wasn't trumping trot or jazz or theater shows yet. So bands breaking up became a bit of a theme for Shin as he tried to accomplish this in different ways. There's Shin Joong-hyun and the Blues Tet, Shin Joong-hyun and the Donkeys, and the Questions, and the Men, etc. His discography is needlessly confusing because of that. And I'd imagine part of him jumping around is the fact that he doesn't really sing in this era. A few of his records are instrumental, but largely as his writing is evolving and throughout the 60s becoming more psychedelic with each band, he seems like he's maybe very conscious of how well the vocals fit with each style he plays, so he ends up working with many different vocalists and the overall group changes with them. There are through lines in each of these bands though. His presence is always felt regardless of who's singing or who's playing drums, you know? Like in reality, he's basically a co-frontman with whoever the singer is. As his guitar, when playing in energetic songs, has this distinct, loose, winding flimsiness to its garage rock tone, as if he's doing as much as he can with a not that amazing guitar. No idea if that's accurate. In any images from this time, his guitars look pretty good, but the pang to some of those notes gives that vibe to me. However, him shifting around the musicians he works with so much set himself up for the section of his career that would eventually earn him mainstream success in Korea, which actually happened at a point where he was considering leaving. He thought, if this sound isn't working in Korea, then maybe I'll try Vietnam. I don't know why Vietnam, you'd have to ask him, but it doesn't matter, because soon 2 women who also performed at military bases under the name the Pearl Sisters came to him wanting to work on an album together. Within that partnership, Shin moves further into the background while still being essential. He produced and wrote the songs for the Pearl Sisters' first record, and his guitar isn't nearly as much of a focus as the 2 of them on most tracks. So instead of just pulling over exactly what he was already doing, he instead created what fit them. You know, you can see he's messing around a lot more with orchestration and acoustic stuff. And that, it turns out, was apparently also what fit Korea. Because to his own surprise, this was his first hit and launched him in a new direction. Like legitimately, given the amount of different albums and compilations you can find from the Pearl Sisters across not even that many years, clearly they were doing just fine after this. So he continued to work with Pearl Sisters to much success while also writing songs for and making several stars out of plenty of other singers. Lim Ah-young, Kim Sang-hee, Joong-hyun, even a gentle folk singer like Yang Hee-yoon he worked with a little bit, very off of Shin's default style. Having a lineup of artists like that, a lot of album covers would even be branded with the Shin Joong-hyun sound, basically to tell anybody who sees it in a store that, hey, this guy touched this record, so you know it's good. And of all the singers he partnered with in this time, I would specifically highlight Kim Jung-mi and Kim Chu-ja. The latter pretty much dominated the 70s, having a surplus of hits, working with Shin, among others, basically also being a sex symbol in Korea as her sultry, breathy voice brings this effective soulfulness to the songs she's handed, whether it's psychedelic stuff, or orchestral, or vaguely big band, or funk. It's just a very charismatic vocal style that works with a number of different sounds. Shin himself describes her like, you can hear her dancing in her voice. Every sway or step or hip shake or whatever is present in the vocals. It wouldn't feel quite the way it does if she sang it standing still. Kim Jung-mi, on the other hand, is perhaps the voice that best fits the core of what Shin's style is. To pair with his kind of mystic, expansive psychedelia, maybe a little psych folkish, she brings this very floaty, alluring voice that kinda talks with the instruments rather than placing itself clearly and cleanly in front of them all. Her swaying vocals can occasionally blend in, giving a bit more air to the record and an almost spiritual vibe. I don't know, but it's cool. Her album Now would have a very reasonable argument for being the strongest release of this era. So that's part of the range of people that Shin is working with, as he's only gotten more and more opportunities since producing the Pearl Sisters and founding this Shin Joong-hyun division of various musicians. He's doing just about everything he could have hoped for at that point where he almost left to go to Vietnam. Because at the same time, he's still releasing some albums with bands of his own. But before moving further on that, it's important to check back in on the general state of Korea. The 50s obviously begin with the Korean War and the nation being more firmly split between North and South. And to simplify it, South Korea wasn't doing that great before the war, and they're doing worse for quite a while after. Poor living conditions, economy, and leadership. Nothing's going well. So playing off those issues, there was a military coup in 1961 that placed this guy, Park Chung-hee, as the new leader of the country. And although it was a forceful coup, he opted to keep the nation as a democracy. As soon after, he simply ran for election, won that, then years later ran for re-election, and won again. Now, Park is interesting because he legitimately was quite effective as a leader in several ways. The economy was improving, he started focusing on industrialization, he heavily lowered the amount of poverty among people. A lot of things were pushed in a positive direction quite quickly given Korea's circumstances, and he gave the country some actual reason for optimism. To the point that many Koreans today seem to still think very highly of him. However, when Park Chung-hee met the two-term limit for presidents in South Korea, he pitched that, let's maybe change the rules a little bit and make the limit be, let's say, 3 terms? And would you look at that? That would actually mean that I get to run one more time. What do you say? And due to his success so far, enough people actually agree to that adjustment. So with that change going through, he's then quite shocked when the following 1971 election ends in a loss for his opponent. But by only 1 million votes. That's just ridiculous. That's unacceptable for Park. How could these people be so ungrateful? It's absurd. But then after calming down, he thought about it and decided that, I want to be a dictator. The term limit should be changed from 3 to never. The people's vote should be changed to an electoral vote filled with my friends. And nobody's allowed to run against me, so that's a democracy we all want. Because shockingly, once he's able to change the rules and move the goalpost once, he's only more emboldened to do it again and again. So once Park Chung-hee reaches that level, he's using it to silence political adversaries, but also anything that could be perceived as criticism of him and the government within media, even if you have to squint and turn your head upside down to see it that way. He persecuted poets, held back filmmakers. He even began pushing that any albums released must contain at least one of what they call the healthy songs, which praise Korea and/or the government and can work as propaganda. Here, in the early 70s, given Shin Joong-hyun's huge popularity at that point, they specifically called him on the phone and told him to write a song praising Park. And Shin said, "Nah, I don't want to do that," and hung up. The phone rang again, and they told Shin that wasn't a request, it was a demand. So he said, "Oh, nah, I don't want to do that," and hung up again. Instead, with the band Shin Joong-hyun and the Men, he made the song Beautiful Rivers and Mountains, this 10-minute long track expressing appreciation not for Park or the government, but for the natural beauty of Korea's land. And obviously, something like that is just unacceptable. So from there, Park's got his eye on Shin. He's pissed, his ego is bruised, he's not going to let that guy get away with blowing him off like that. And he's going to strike at the worst possible moment. Anyways, things are going swell for Shin. He still has no shortage of projects going on. The Shin Joong-hyun division is going strong and there's no end in sight. The only thing he's missing is that while he's written all these great songs for himself and others, he's missing that one album, a cohesive artistic statement in the form of an LP that refines what came before and casts a shadow over what comes next. A record where if any fan wants to introduce his work to someone else, they can always easily point to that one. His work, and Korea's music market in general, had yet to start its own age of the album, using that medium to its fullest potential, like how the West was, at least by 1966, with Pet Sounds, Revolver, Blonde on Blonde, etc. It was still very focused on live performances and singles. In some cases, you could say people followed the career of a particular song more so than they did an artist and their discography. as a hit would be passed around and covered by countless artists and put on countless records and compilations. Or a song would just be passed around until inevitably somebody, somewhere, was able to turn it into a hit. Now, of course, with early album development anywhere, it begins with single-song-oriented releases, where it's basically just a hit single and then a bunch of other songs that nobody cares about but can fill out the record. But it's just more strongly the case in Korea, long after a point where, like, they've heard Sgt. Pepper's, you know? Like even that first album with Shin and the Pearl Sisters. The first half are these very well cared for songs with the sisters singing, and side 2 is just some instrumental tracks from Shin's prior band. It's as if they were jump scared by the fact that the record actually has a second side that they need to fill. Making the most of every track was just not the priority. Shin, of anyone, was brushing up against a consistent album experience with the donkeys and the men. Those are both a good listen all the way through. But he doesn't fully crack the code and make something that feels truly finished and distinct until he forms the trio Yupjuns. This is the most focused of his many bands, scaling things back heavily to just a drummer, a bassist, and Shin taking the role of lead singer and guitarist. After years of him working with no shortage of musicians to pull from to accomplish whatever he needed, he's limiting himself here, kinda like putting on training weights, seeing if he can still get to that level with just 3 guys. And really, he surpasses it. The more condensed group actually has much more energy to it than any of his larger ones. Certainly punchier, as the rhythms often have fairly rapid bounces to them before settling into more easygoing grooves backed by an acoustic guitar. I'd also say that he's pulling in catchier melodies for tracks here, likely more so from his experience with other acts rather than his own bands. And the musicianship is also more clear. Shin's usual stringy rhythm guitar expands out to fill more of that space, complemented by the little fiddly flourishes that he adds in. But even more so than Shin, I think the bassist steals the show here. He's great. His playing has this rusted funk vibe with a thump that doesn't hide how much it's driving the song forward. Like, really, a good chunk of the time, it feels just as much like the lead instrument as the guitars do. Everything just works better here. Even the roughness of these recordings especially fits Yupjuns when those instrumentals very squarely fit into the psychedelic toned garage rock area. Especially with Shin as a vocalist, he's not as refined or smooth as most of the singers he's worked with before. To be frank, he kinda sounds like an old man even though he was only 40. But that's cool, I like it. The imperfection there and the reverb of the recording adds a bit more ruggedness to the places where it's okay to have it. Because in other aspects, the Yupjuns' debut is quite clean and refined. The purposefulness of a lot of it can be felt. Like, firstly, the fact that all of the songs here are new is actually a big deal. None of them were a re-recording of Shin's, or a cover song, or something he wrote for someone else first. They were written for this record specifically. So you get greater cohesion, with also more room to experiment when tracks aren't all designed to stand on their own removed from the album. Some songs have extended instrumental jams. Or in a very different direction, there's the closing song, I Love You, which is a meditative, tinny, percussive track with almost humming vocals. It's a calming end to the album, and still kinda connects to the 70s psychedelic mood, just in a very different way than Shin's wavy guitar lines do. Was it gonna get radio play? No, of course not. But does it positively add to the record? Yes. Or also, in a stranger way, the meticulousness is present in the track I Don't Know, where after a few segments of singing about a woman, one of the band members stops the song to basically say, hey wait, you're not singing this correctly. The tone isn't matching the lyrics.
야, 그 가사가 그, 야, 그 애인이 화낸다. 뭐, 그 뭐냐, 그, 야. 다시 하자.
So they adjust and get back to the song after a bit of bickering. And it sounds obvious to explain this, but it's presenting itself as a fun, off-the-cuff thing when obviously it isn't. every part of that was organized. It's another example of how much you can think through and plan out with individual songs and the album's construction. Essentially, the main point is that while past albums would be banged out and recorded really quickly, I'd have to assume that that was much less the case on the Yupchun's debut. Definitely, along with the 2 compilations put out by Light in the Attic Records that have songs from throughout his career and across the many artists he's worked with, this would be what I strongly recommend. And that'd be the case for any version of it because there are several. I've so far been describing the initial release of the album. This was a promo version that was shopped around to test its viability. But afterwards, the record label wasn't confident it'd be a success, thinking maybe there isn't a hit here, the songs could be too long, stuff like that. So then they did some re-recordings and adjusting. Some tracks are shortened, but 2 new songs are added. There are more guitar lines, and they're more upfront in the mix. In general, everything's sharper and has a bit more urgency without losing the grooves. This would be the second version, and is what the general public in Korea got to buy. But then when the album was remastered and released outside Korea way later, we get a third version of the album. And that seems to be the production style of the second release, and the track order of the second release, but with the longer versions of the songs from the promo release, except for the 2 songs that were exclusive to the second release because they're here with the same structure they always had. Do you see what I mean now when I say that all the reissues make researching Korean albums confusing? Because if not, then what if I told you that... Ha! I lied! That third version was actually the 4th version! The real third version was a 2003 release when they took the first version of the album and had Shin dub over it with a new fuzzy guitar track in the center of the mix. 4 versions of this album, and it took me forever to fucking sort that out. Turns out, though, that at least the first step of that annoyance was the correct move, because the proper Korean release of that album did produce a hit in the form of the song Beautiful Woman. Finally, after over a decade since first trying it with the Ad 4, there's an actual rock hit directly from the man himself. The sound he's always been most drawn towards now has some momentum towards the mainstream in Korea. Between his own band and the Shin Joong-hyun division, what more could he possibly ask for right now? Legitimately, everything is perfect. It's not even raining. Park Chung-hee started banning his songs. The second that one of his own bands is getting real success, Shin gets knocked back down because of that guy's bruised ego. And the fact that the reasoning is bullshit didn't matter. Just the fact that so much of his music was banned, that put the stink on Shin. The Upchuns couldn't sell their record anymore, they couldn't find venues that would book them for shows, even after releasing more timid follow-up. It didn't matter. The stink was still there, and it's all just really sad. The regime had begun enacting further laws to crack down on live performances, where you can't perform publicly unless it's at specific establishments, and to play there you had to have your set approved by authorities. So they were iced out and left to suffer in this purgatory for no good reason, until Park opts to make things worse by arresting Shin along with several other musicians for possessing weed. For a while, Shin's stuck legitimately being tortured in prison before being released back into this other hell where he still can't do the one desire he has, which is to play the guitar on stage. Park's eventual assassination about 4 years later, while leading to the song bans being lifted, wasn't necessarily an all-cure for Shin's situation. Yeah, he could perform again, but with that much time having passed, he was out of step with the country. He felt a disconnect. People's tastes had changed, new stars had shown up, rock had to start over again, and to many he was old. He was forgotten. The guy who the US troops demanded to see perform, the guy who made the first Korean rock band, who pushed psychedelic rock to the public, who helped a number of great artists earn success, who wrote countless hits, the guy whose name they put on the front of practically any album he touched. It's like none of that even happened. He put out some more albums, penned a few songs for others, but really only at the twilight of his career does Shin get reevaluated and have his importance to Korea's music history more largely recognized. He's had some years since then, so maybe he's at peace with it, but you can't help but wonder how it might have gone otherwise. Yeopjeon's actually had a proper follow-up album being worked on that we only have a leak of. And what if that had gotten released off the back of Beautiful Woman being hit? What new artists does he go on to work with? How does he continue to evolve with the late 70s going into the 80s? Or how does Korean music as a whole change when it doesn't have to stop and work around this empty void of music that was stamped out of the country all because of some whiny dictator? Because needless to say, Shin was not the only person affected by this sort of thing. Rock musicians like him and Kim Jung-mi and others were targeted, but at the same time the other big category is folk music. You have artists like Han Dae-su and Kim Min-gi in the 70s doing the classic folk archetype of just some guy wandering with his guitar, like Dylan with a harmonica, except sometimes there isn't a harmonica, it's just a guitar, and maybe flutes with it, or a bass instead, or light percussion, or the harmonica again. You know what I mean, it's a folk guy thing. But neither of these guys were the overly political version of that archetype. The protest singers, like Phil Oakes. For example, Han Dae-su's lyrics are very nature-based, very illustrative, but that doesn't mean the image of its meaning is clear, and especially whether or not any metaphors are pointing towards the Korean government. One could look at his songs in plenty of different ways, and most of them would be more emotive rather than direct commentary. And yet, it doesn't matter. He put out 2 albums in the 70s, and then boom, both banned. The censorship inevitably became more than just pushing away criticism, but in general, pushing away any form of counterculture before it gains enough steam to create change. So rock music at that time applied because it was a style for youth culture, for energy, for unrest, not for the establishment. And folk artists like Han Dae-su with their long hair weren't the clean-cut, loyal salarymen. They were the hippies, and him in particular I'd think was a version of that was more intimidating because he has a bit of the later punk energy to him. Like if you listen to that first track on his debut, there's a real growl to his voice at points. Especially when I'm pretty sure he's just making noises and isn't even using words. Those vocals hint at this ferocity that probably wasn't in much music at that point, even in the West, but could grow and be more and more identified with by the public as an emotion that they wanted to express but couldn't. So whether it's to that extent or just the hair going past his shoulders, a hyper-conservative government wants to squash that before it even has a chance of becoming a problem for them. Kim Min-gi, meanwhile, was a case where that wasn't quite as effective. He was making gentler, more melancholic youth culture folk music pretty casually around his time at university. Like he never even played something that you would call a proper concert. But he released some of those either through his own debut album or by giving his songs to contemporary artists such as Yang Hee-yoon. One song in particular, Morning Dew, actually became a success. And it was actually being viewed as one of those aforementioned healthy songs, because its lyrics illustrate getting past a point of struggle and coming out with optimism. But then it started to be adopted more strongly by university students, the type of people who you'd find protesting, with them interpreting that struggle that you have to work through being what Korea is going through currently. So of course, once that gained steam, banned. Nobody can listen to the song anymore. Kim Min-gi's albums were pulled off store shelves. They didn't want to see his name on any record ever again. But like with Han Dae-su, in reality, Morning Dew just isn't overtly political. It's a general enough metaphor that, yeah, it could be used that way, but also as speaking positively about Korea. Or apparently it's also been viewed as wanting to move past the Americanization of Korea. But to the government, because one of those interpretations was bad for them, just get rid of it. And the thing is, doing so only adds more power to that exact interpretation. You're reinforcing the meaning the song had to those people, and as a result, even with the government trying to burn as many of his albums as they could, it's said that Kim Min-gi's songs stayed alive through these people singing them themselves and passing them along like hymns. As such, there were even attempts to ban people covering his music. But in the next decade, when protesters were fighting for a real democracy, Morning Dew would often be sung as a rallying cry. The government's fear was a self-fulfilling prophecy. This level of censorship was doomed to fail eventually, but in its time, it did disrupt a lot of careers and the natural path and evolution of Korean music as a whole. If you look at musicians' discographies from that time, you'll often see new releases screech to a halt around 1975 with the bannings and marijuana scandals, or there's this strange gap going from there to a bit into the 80s when there's a new dictatorship under Chun Doo-hwan, who has a lot of the same issues as Park, including censorship, but happened to lift a few of the previous bands. So with those cases, you have that gap in Shin's career only ending when Park dies, Kim Jung-mi just disappearing from music in the late 70s, or folk albums not really being a thing again until the late 80s. A lot is lost in that space. Of the few who manage to work within that small amount of freedom, then succeed, and maintain that, there are two undeniably worth bringing up in the late 70s and early 80s. The first of which is Sanullim. Three brothers who formed a band in their university days, as colleges were pretty much the only environment that still had rock bands, and essentially carried the torch of all the rock artists who were wiped out of the culture after being included in that marijuana incident that destroyed Shin's career. Though that isn't to say that Sanullim is redundant of those artists. In fact, if they were all playing today, Sanullim would still stand out well on their own, as their strengths aren't in catchy melodies or alluring vocals, they're in the grooves and fluidity. The band's roughness has a lot of open space and ends up surprisingly comforting as you're enveloped by the stereo mix with the guitar and piano on each side, and the rhythm section and vaguely echoey vocals in the center. And you get lulled by this krautrock-esque consistency to the groove and the guitar fuzz that takes its sweet time before getting to any singing. Rarely with their songs will you feel a stark difference in sound and energy from section to section. There's often a core to each song, like a drum beat or a bass line, that doesn't change a ton. The song overall is still going to different places, but there's a consistency within it that ends up a little hypnotic to the point that you don't even notice.
저 앞에 전주를 보통 이제 가요를 3분 예술이라고 하는데 이게 처음 판이 나와서 방송에 처음 걸린 거는 CBS 정오 프로그램이었어요. 제가 판이 나오자마자 김진성 씨라고 유명한 프로듀서가 있었는데 그 형님한테 갔더니 새 판이 나왔네. 그리고 빨리 좀 마지막 곡으로 틀어줄게. 그러고 틀었어요. 틀었는데 둥둥둥 쭉 가는데 형 얼굴색이 점점 고동색으로 변했어요. 야, 노래 언제 나오니? 노래 언제 나와? 그러다가
Even when the vocals do come in, that doesn't automatically pull you out of that hypnosis because they're honestly kind of unremarkable. The singer is usually pretty frank, even a bit monotone. It wouldn't stand out on its own, but it fits with their sound. They're kind of like if Can had a tad more pop rock to them, especially when you listen to their fifth album, which is my favorite, where vocals are a particularly minor focus. With both bands, I don't think specific songs or specific moments stick with you and make you want to play it on repeat again and again and again and show it to someone else who will immediately be hooked on it as well. They just don't work that way. But when you're listening to a record of theirs and you fully sunk into the atmosphere and togetherness of the band, you don't want to leave. Like really, when I was first getting into them, I was plowing through so many of their records in just one day. Give me the next one, give me the next one, give me the next one. They have around 12 and they just kept being good. It's crazy. As for how they managed to make so many of those in the 70s and 80s without being pushed down like the other rock and folk artists at the time, it's tough to say exactly. As you could guess, the censorship of media being reviewed before release seems based on pretty arbitrary reasoning just by the whims of the regime. Like Kim Chang-won mentions how lyrical topics like death or two people sleeping in the same bed would be deemed risky for songs that young people may be singing, and may be rejected on those grounds. Or even just ending a song on a particular chord could apparently present a certain idea that the regime didn't want. So it doesn't seem like there was a clear checklist of make sure your music doesn't do this, or this, or this, and you're good. So from my understanding, Sanullim was cooperative when told that their music was rejected and had to be adjusted. They wouldn't say, no way, we're not going to change it, fuck off. However, they would try to be clever about how they work around it and have the end result still be as close to what they initially planned as they can get away with. He mentions getting around one rejection, not by changing the song, but just changing how it was written, because the inspectors would review it via sheet music. Whatever the issue was, he thought, what if I just remove all the measure divides on the sheet? and make it look like one single long measure instead. Will that work? And it did, because, you know, the whole situation is stupid. The other guy to discuss here is Cho Yong-pil, someone who at first completely failed at avoiding one of the government's landmines, but eventually had a level of success in this era greater than anyone else. Like, it's not even close, it's pretty insane. But he got his start a ways earlier, playing at military shows in the late 60s, from there ending up in various bands, playing stuff from country to rock, blues, soul, just in general being very active and bouncing around until finally finding some real popularity as a solo artist with his 1976 single, Come Back to Busan Port. Big success both in Korea and Japan. So naturally, he soon got pulled into a marijuana scandal and had his songs banned and his career put on pause for the rest of the 70s. However, obviously it doesn't end there. Once Park was gone, Cho Yong-pil got right back on the horse. His first full album came out only about 5 months after Park died, and then he gets another before the year ends, another in 81, then 82, 83, 84, 85, 85 again, all successes. He just dominates that first half of the 80s under the new dictatorship of Chun Doo-hwan. And his sound in this time is something that, in all honesty, wasn't grabbing me at first. For being dubbed their own King of Pop, I expected these albums to stick with me immediately, but instead I would listen, relatively enjoy it while listening, and then not really think of it again. I didn't really get a solid appreciation of him until I was reading the book You Call That Music. In that, to explain his immense popularity, they write about how his albums managed to bring together in one place basically all the different popular sounds of Korea to that point. Like, first listen to a song like Short Hair from his first album. This is something that has this pop catchiness, but the band layout and the instrumentals being a bit beefier gives it light rock DNA, but also the simple, straightforward momentum of the song, along with the slight shake in his voice, feels a bit more like Trot. And on top of all that, there's something more new with this disco flavoring, with the keys and danciness. It's got everything. Now, it's not like every song of his is that much of a blend of sounds. Usually it's more like these are spread out across an album. But Short Hair kind of distills why he worked so well. He was an already very capable musician who stylistically was kind of a jack of all trades. And then he had the powerful enough vocal ability to play center stage and sell any one of those faces. Like, yeah, maybe the song Not Me feels too much like Trot for younger fans. Maybe a rock track like Self-Respect doesn't work for older generations. Or parts of folk song medley are too weird, or the ballads are too dramatic. Whatever it is, everyone was gonna still be able to find a chunk of songs that they really loved on a Cho Yong-pil album, and they think of those ones before the one or two that weren't their speed. He really seems like practically a one-man show for the whole country in this early part of his career. When you research 1980 to 84-ish, not many other names are coming up, especially in rock, which was very slowly rebuilding itself. And the less competition, I'm sure, enhanced the extent of his domination here, but to be clear, he was going to be a star regardless. He had a hit in each decade from the 70s to the 2010s at least. So if others were in the ring with him, he's still winning a few rounds. It's just kinda strange though that Cho Yong-pil could basically be his own bubble of an era in a way that I hadn't seen anywhere else. Like, it feels like the 80s don't start to form its own overall identity and spread of artists until 4 solid years of Cho Yong-pil have passed. At around 1984, 85, a decent ways removed from Park now, it seems like in regards to music, the tie has been loosened a little bit more. You're getting a lot more notable artists popping up and releasing records, and in defining this era, you can largely divide it up into 2 areas: the mainstream TV acts and the underground scene. With that mainstream side of the 80s, you have a lot of the usual suspects as far as sounds go. Synths, electric drums, that one bass tone, you know what I'm talking about. But the bigger deal was that with color TV becoming commonplace in Korea, a lot of the popular acts are the ones able to take advantage of that medium and lean into visual aspects to the music in one way or another. And that had always been a tool to use with TV before, or with theater shows. But the scale to the performances in these top-of-the-pops-esque shows is getting up there with big-budget stages and effects, So it makes sense that a ton of the music being showcased here have dance beats to them, and choreography to go with it. Kim Wan-sun was a big name here, and if she wasn't being hyper-energetic herself, then she would always have a ton of people on stage with her dancing. Just more stuff moving, more to keep your eyes occupied. Like, half of her songs in this era were actually ballads, but like, what can you do with those on TV, besides a dramatic close-up? So yeah, do the dance songs. They're pretty good anyways. You just want to work with a bit more showmanship, even in passive ways. Sun-hee is another worth mentioning here. Honestly, for skill alone, she has a great voice, she can belt stuff out, hold the notes, those sort of very obviously impressive flourishes, and all without it feeling like she's trying too hard. But I do wonder if in addition to that, she benefited from having a very distinct look to her. The short hair, big glasses, the overall cute, boyish look. It wasn't what any other woman pop stars at the time looked like. A clean style that works with the conservative public, but a distinct one that they'll remember you for. And not that I mean it's something that was intentionally used by her this way, it's just her style. But I think that after their talent, first and foremost, aspects like style, or dance, personality, showmanship, are what people, whether as ballad artists or more catchy, upbeat dance pop artists, utilize to play ball and stand out within broadcast and be part of this initial front wave of artists after Yong-pil, but not push the envelope too much, or you could end up stuck underground. Though when I use the term underground, the sounds that you likely imagine based on that term and this era do not quite match up with this. Korea's 80s underground scene is unique. It differs heavily from the UK's or America's or probably plenty of other places, which were filled with, in short, punk bands. Punk music in general still had yet to even make any real effect on Korea, even though on paper you would think Korea's recent environment would be primed for that. And that could be exactly why it didn't, because one of the things censorship did get ahead of was music coming in from outside of Korea. Even in the 60s, they sometimes adjusted album art for Korean versions, and by the 70s a lot was outright banned from coming in, especially something so clearly counterculture like punk. And even what few pirated copies there were of LPs from those sort of bands supposedly only came around years later in the 80s. So this is one way where the Korean evolution of music is offset or rearranged a bit from elsewhere. This version of an underground scene began under a much stricter framework than many others, when people just didn't want to deal with those laws that Park had installed, where you could only perform at certain limited establishments and with prior approval from authorities. For Korea at this time, those who weren't going to be allowed to perform in many of those places and didn't have the right look or mannerisms or whatever to be shown on TV, that category includes a wide range of people. So rather than it largely being based around the amateur DIY styles of people who learned 3 chords and started playing punk music in a basement, this scene is actually filled with people who are all proudly proficient at their instruments and are open to different sounds. Like, there does just seem to be more intermingling and less firm genre divides here. Like, I read one thing where in the 90s there was a metal forum page where metal fans would talk, and a few bands that went on to be notable formed there. One was another metal band called Noise Garden. They mostly sound how you imagine they sound. And the other was called Sisters Barbershop. Let's listen to some of them. So that's what I mean. Something like that could still be connected to the polar opposite sound. And that's shown in this scene itself. Some of its most notable artists do include the beginning of Korean metal and hard rock, starting in the early 80s with Magma bringing in these thin-sounding but very sharp guitar sounds that still have a little blues to them, and then evolving to a beefier, more destructive sound when there's soon a big 3 to come out and be at the forefront of that style, in the form of Buall, Sinawe, and Baekdu-san. Yes, that is their album cover. But at the same time in this scene, the other really important band here is Deulgukhwa, who's usually said to be Korea's Beatles, because apparently every country needs their own, and you would sure guess these guys were vying for that role given the cover of their debut album. But that doesn't mean it's unfounded. Like actually, as far as other instances I know of that label being given to a band, like Happy End in Japan or Suru Hiran in Argentina, the comparison arguably doesn't go much deeper than being the country's most important rock band that is composed of 4 dudes. Otherwise, they're wildly different. But Deulgukhwa actually fit the comparison pretty well sonically too. Like you could easily make the Beatles comparison after hearing some of their songs without knowing anything else about them. Their instrumentals emote similarly. Like there's a sensitivity to Deulgukhwa that crosses over with late era Beatles, especially in their ear for vocal melodies. But they're not a copycat. Deulgukhwa is their own thing, as they funnel that through this largely piano-based rock and folk that, on their first record, can pretty much be split up into 2 categories. There are the quieter, intimate tracks that are just the vocalist and either a piano or guitar. The standout among those is easily the track Everyday Be With You, short and simply structured, but has a great melody that's added to with the harmonies and given atmosphere with these consistent bird chirp sounds that fit with the acoustic guitar. The second category is basically these soaring ballads that build up to be bigger and bigger. The sort of thing where in the middle of the song, when everything's at 100%, suddenly the instruments will all cut out at once and you get the singer belting out a line on his own before the drums kick in again. Really pushing the drama, but it's convincingly so. And no musical layer that's added as the song builds ever feels completely unnecessary. There were a few songs with more straightforward urgency to change up the pace of the record, but those first 2 styles are their specialty. It's what the soulfulness of their sound, and especially the singer's raw, wounded voice, best works within. Like, this debut album is certainly one of the easiest recommendations I can make in this video. Kind of a shame that after their second album wasn't as well received, they broke up. Still some strong tracks on there, and they definitely had other great albums in them if they kept at it, as shown by their one proper reunion album from 2013, also actually being pretty good. It's not surprising that of the bands who weren't with the big TV networks at this time, Deulgukhwa managed to get the most attention with that record and their reportedly very passionate surplus of concerts. In general, it got more eyes looking towards where they started from and the other rock bands that potentially might spring from a counterculture scene like them. And it turns out that soon a lot would. One of the main differences between Chun Doo-hwan and Park Chung-hee's reigns was that Chun Doo-hwan was never going to be president for life. He'd have one term that ends in 1987, and that's it. He wouldn't be able to adjust the Constitution to get around that himself like Park did. So hypothetically, perhaps throughout all the issues with his regime, you could at least think maybe the next guy will be better. But even that went out the window when at the start of the year, Chun announced that he was going to choose his successor for the next election, confirming that it isn't a choice for the people. It's still going to be a fake election. One of his buddies is going to be president, and it's all just going to be the same thing with a new face. The frustration of that, plus the police torturing and killing a protesting college student and failing to cover it up from the public, plus another student at a later protest being hospitalized and later dying, plus Chun Doo-hwan officially naming Roh Tae-wo as his successor, plus everything else they've done in the past 8 years, it's a lot of final straws. There were always some people pushing against his regime, whether behind the scenes or out in the open, but when these issues coalesced in June of that year, the size of the protests were absurd. They flooded the streets, and remained doing so for days and days and days, from the 10th until the 29th, when the government finally relented and would allow direct elections. After almost 20 years, Korea was no longer stuck under authoritarian rule. Obviously, a huge moment for every aspect of the country. You could go on and on and on about this whole stretch of history. Like, I had no idea about Kim Dae-jung's whole story, from being Park's greatest rival in the 1971 election, to being almost executed during his reign, to finally becoming president in 98, crazy stuff like that, or the fact that this whole situation in 1987 basically already happened almost 30 years earlier. The people overthrew the US-appointed President Syngman Rhee, who made all the same mistakes with the rigged elections and student deaths. History all repeating itself so quickly. Just so much interesting stuff, but gotta stay focused a bit. So, again, for this topic, as the country transitions out of that, the tie is almost off. In the coming years, you're getting sounds that were pushed down previously. Folk comes back with Kim Kwang-seok, whose style is a bit more full and polished than the 70s singers, but a similar lyrical spirit is there. You have artists adding more new wrinkles to familiar territory, like Kim Wan-sun and other comparable artists expand out from the pretty straight dance and ballads that she was doing before. And in the 90s, Kim Wan-sun actually gets really popular in Taiwan, apparently, so stuff is starting to eke out of Korea a bit more. Another is Jae-ha, who released his first and sadly only album not long after the protests in '87. This is a guy who's classically trained. He went to school for music, and if you hand him an instrument, he can probably play it. But he doesn't know too much for his own good. He doesn't overplay his hand in trying to adapt all that into musically illustrative but vocally somber pop songs. Even the more layered, colorful, full band spots feel pretty finely tuned with what moving pieces and pet sounds are there, like the opening track. And the majority of the tracks anyways are these ballads that keep a clear focus on the piano and his vocals, and build up from that more subtly than I think a lot of other songwriters would have managed. Like, you don't notice all the pieces being added until the whole structure is built, and suddenly you realize, oh, there's strings and drums and a guitar, The ballad genre would have a consistently strong presence in the 90s in no small part because of this album. And then in this era, there's stuff that's just, weirder than usual. Before now, you wouldn't have seen the slightest of success from a group like Pippi Band, an eccentric alt-rock group who, it's even rumored, chose their singer based on who had the worst voice. In both sound and appearance, they're way off the Lee Sun-hee, Yong-pil molds of what was allowed to succeed before. And it's not like these guys are superstars, mind you. The industry isn't necessarily going to fully support and boost up the likes of them, but since there's now actual room to breathe and work within, such a forceful personality is going to somehow make themselves known anyways and find its audience. A similar case with an arguably even stranger band, N.EX.T, and its frontman Shin, who actively experiments all throughout his career. With N.EX.T, just listen to the first album. Most tracks manage to sound like the band is playing 3 completely different songs at the same time. Synth and dance beats on one layer, then a metal guitar solo on top, and then occasional hooked on a feeling-esque Uga Chaka gang vocals. Right from the get-go, it's this incomprehensible energy. And then with their second album, they trick you into thinking they've locked themselves down more so, because the first chunk of that is pretty easily definable as progressive metal that's made special by Shin being a frontman with such theater kid energy this side of Meatloaf and the Decemberists that the songs feel like they must be soundtracking a movie or something, even though they aren't. It's still odd, just more consistent and comprehensible. But then one of those metal tracks ends with a solo piano segment. And then the next song is a legitimately beautiful acoustic track. And then there's some funk rhythms with a hard rock coat of paint on it. And then there's a full-on techno song. Like, who is this for? What's the audience for all of this at once? Nobody. And that's great. People are now free to make music for no audience in particular. If these guys really wanted to, they could even go further off the wall and make some sort of space rock opera for the hell of it. Oh look, they did! You see what I mean? There's just immensely more wiggle room for creative people to use without worry. And that's something that earns us not only way more weird, unique anomalies, but also more leaps forward from artists who will set the stage for the next several decades of popular music, and don't have their influence suddenly blockaded by censorship. For example, this is when punk actually enters the equation. And you have plenty of bands like Yellow Kitchen, No Brain, or eventually The Geeks, and the most notable among them being Crying Nut. We're the best type of punk band in that they also listen to reggae. They've got punk rock, reggae flavoring, ska, surf rock, polka music. Basically, a la The Clash, they do whatever the hell they want, and that's way more punk than just playing fast and loud all the time. But whatever they are, it also put them at the front wave of indie music in general for Korea, as the split album from Crying Nut and Yellow Kitchen from the label Drug Records is seen as the first proper indie release, and the later success of their own debut album firmly showcased how much could still be accomplished without the backing of a major, as soon they'd not only be the face of Korean punk, or Korean indie, but one of the big names of Korean rock, period. Like, if you're listening to any modern Korean indie band, there's a good chance they loved Crying Nut. I'd most easily recommend their album Poor Hand Love Song, but really anything they have, especially early on, succeeds in getting across the spirit of the band. That continuous, infectious energy where rarely does it sound as if these guys aren't having a blast playing whatever song you're listening to and giving 100% to whatever twists they have going on in it. Not too bad for a bunch of guys who supposedly started the band only to get girls, and because of that, initially all wanted to be the guitarist and had to have someone else designate the instruments to each of them. Meanwhile, in the less indie area of Korean music, 3 young men appear on the popular MBC talent show to promote their debut single. Dressed like a cross between JoJo's and Seinfeld, they sync together on these absurdly slippery dance moves to a sample-filled New Jack Swing beat, which is broken up once in a while by fits of a metal guitar riff where one of them can step up and go crazy for a minute, all enhanced by the charismatic vocal performance of the frontman. Punchy rapping in the verses, smooth singing in the chorus, and passionate for both. A well-oiled machine of a performance for a song catchier than anything heard on the show before. 3 minutes and 20 seconds of perfection. The judges gave them the lowest score that episode. Seo Taiji and boys. Not Seo Taiji and the boys. Seo Taiji and boys. Any will do. We're a trio formed by Seo Taiji, soon after his brief stint playing bass for that earlier metal band Sinawe. A factoid that obviously definitely won't become more relevant later. And if there was ever a line drawn to signal the start of a new generation, it was that performance of their first single, I Know. The judges weren't sure what to make of it, but acknowledged themselves that what the viewers think will be more telling. And they told quickly. The sales of that single and its parent album shot up and became an immediate hit, one of the biggest debut albums in Korean history. And with the energy and spectacle of the 3 guys in sync 1 minute and then seamlessly swapping places in the spotlight the next, combined with the couldn't get out of your head if you used a vacuum level of catchiness, and the mishmash of genres, none of which were huge in the country at that point, there was clearly influence to be had, and that wasted no time either. This is really the first big boost of those boy groups, girl groups, the clear step towards the modern K-pop mold. And when I first listened to these guys, after often seeing them mentioned as one of the big pillars in Korean music, I liked them right away because, you know, a damn good melody is a damn good melody. It works on anybody. But after one listen through of that first record, I did feel like, okay, I think I get what these guys are pretty much about. I see the strengths. I see that exact later influence that it has. Cool. And I stopped there for a bit. But it turns out that even just that is majorly underselling these guys. They have 3 other records released 1 year after the other, and none of them stay focused on the exact same territory as the last. As easy as it could have been to take the mold of I Know and push out songs with danceable instrumentals, rapping verses, and more open choruses again and again and again, they don't do that. Instead, there's dance pop, there's songs that are more fully hip-hop, with some of those specifically leaning in the gangster rap direction. There's R&B, rock, full-on shredding on several rap metal tracks. Like, there are several points where they're completely unrecognizable from those guys making their debut. That 3rd album is just flat out a rock record, in which you can see that, oh yeah, that guy really was in Sinawe. And the crazy thing is that they do succeed on all these fronts. Like, I don't think they have a bad record. So that's all impressive already, yet I'm especially amazed that they maintained or even grew their popularity while making such drastic changes. I would not guess that people brought on board with this would also be up for this. Yet they all sold great, so the chokehold they had on the 90s is really something. In a way more impressive than Cho Yong-pil's in the 80s. This all comes together to make it so Seo Taiji's importance is basically fourfold, at least. Firstly is the K-pop group influence, as I mentioned before. It is basically ground zero for that form that would eventually dominate even more, as while this group was fairly self-reliant, that's part of why they were free to do whatever stylistic changes they desired, it wouldn't take long for you to see groups like H.O.T. that were likely purposely created to imitate the success of that first record. Secondly, a lot of these different sounds, as well as the fashion and outfits they'd perform in, stem from Seo Taiji consuming a lot of media and culture from outside of Korea. And that's something that a lot of the country, especially when under the rule of Park, whose influence is still felt even though he's long gone by now, is resistant to. They want to stay Korean-focused and push back often on younger generations becoming more open to those outside influences. That's a dam that was always going to break eventually, but Seo Taiji happened to be the one to do it. Once they're rapping in a hit song, showing metal to the mainstream, performing in shows looking like this, or this, or this, or this, there was no going back. People were going to be more willing to take that influence. Third, it's worth pointing out that this band was actually openly political in several songs. Generally a no-go with K-pop, but in some later songs they target flawed aspects of Korea's culture. Like the song Classroom Idea is about the needlessly extreme pressure that's placed on kids to perform in school, and the occasionally cruel ways teachers treat students. The group gets some pushback on this, like I think the song was banned from TV and radio, but those efforts are so much weaker than they were in the 70s and 80s, where people's careers could be completely destroyed. This time it's one of the last hurrahs of anything like that sort of censorship, as people are left to grasp at the old satanic messages are hidden in the song excuse to make people hate them. And it doesn't even work. This is a huge star that's willing and able to voice their actual direct opinions on issues facing the country, and remain successful after doing so. You weren't really seeing that before. Fourth is the fact that he basically brought hip-hop over. He wasn't the first person to try rapping in Korea, but Seo Taiji popularized it. Rapping in Korean would then be strongly tied to K-pop in general, though more so as a piece thrown in to spice up a pop song rather than an actual dominant aspect of the music. But elsewhere it did become more prominent as this opened the door for the success of a group like Doo with their driving, danceable hip-hop, as well as towards the end of the decade when rappers like Drunken Tiger came up, who extended more on that direct connection to the American rap of that era. However, that's something that I don't think worked right away. Like if you listen to the first Drunken Tiger record, it feels a lot like it's just wearing the clothes of those sort of artists, imitating them rather than making the style its own, especially with some of the language it uses. And most of that is understandable. It happens a lot whenever a new branch of something is just starting to grow, especially in a case like this where a lot of the culture associated with rap at the time doesn't really match to Korean experiences, so you're not sure what to fill that space with instead. Because of that, the album from Drunken Tiger that I'm more drawn to is actually Sky is the Limit, which came out almost a decade later.
난 행복의 뒤를 절대 쫓지가 않아 No 행복은 나를 찾아 감싸 안아 행복의 뒤를 절대 쫓지가 않아 No 행복은 나를 찾아 감싸 안아 Yeah 행복의 뒤를 절대 쫓지가 않아 No 행복은 나를 찾아 감싸 안아.
It takes some time for hip-hop to pick up steam in the 2000s, so there can be more authentic releases like that, or acts like Lee Sang, Epic High, Dynamic Duo, and so on. Took a bit of time, but it starts here. That's all so much change so quickly. None of the other decades are even close to being this packed. This whole era after the democratic struggle is setting up what will eventually become the Korean wave. More people are creating, the economy is still improving, Korea starts exporting more, its branches spread out more and more to the point of reaching the surrounding Asian countries and eventually most of the rest of the world. From the 90s, the limitations are few, and there's no blockade coming 15 years down the line to stop it dead in its tracks. There's a clear runway to go down and naturally evolve through each generation. And it applies to all artistic expressions. Like Korean film, as I mentioned at the start. There are a few notable writers, directors, actors in this decade, but exponentially more between then and now. It's especially interesting from an American perspective, as we're overall so self-involved and think of ourselves as the center of the universe. The fact that after building itself up, Korea was able to majorly break through our egos and have huge successes in film, TV, music, all within a few years of each other, I don't need to think of a fancy word, it's just cool. This sort of thing has been opening up a lot more and will only continue to do so. As for all the music that's been made during and after the build-up to that point, whereas before I could half-decently sum up an era by just diving into 3 or 4 artists, it isn't really possible here. Even besides the mega successful K-pop groups, there's just too much good stuff. It'd be too overwhelming to try and run through all the artists I like. I should just let you discover them for yourself, because there's really no way to do this. Certainly nothing remotely comparable to ways I've ended videos before. Like, there's just nothing I could possibly do here, I'm pretty certain. DJ Soulscape, and specifically his album Lovers, is one of those chill sounds that I'd have a tough time imagining anyone disliking, so I should have a lot to say about it. It's definitely one of my favorites of everything here, but I feel like all I need to say is Nujaba's metaphorical music plus Moon Safari by Air. You're welcome. Lee Sang, one of the aforementioned groups of the 2000s, a duo consisting of Gil-seong-jun, better known by his stage name, Gil, and Kang Hee-gun, better known by his stage name, Gary. They're a very welcoming, positive hip-hop, more melodic than a lot of others as their rapping is usually being played off someone else's singing. Like on their second album, Fly High is a call and response.
Fly high, 저 위로. Fly high, 더 위로.
A song like Slow Down is very R&B. Honestly, they're good rappers, but could have easily gotten by just being writers and producers. On that record, I'm in general more impressed with the amount of different instrumentals and conceptual stuff they pull off while consistently fitting this fairly sunny, lax vibe. It's even in kind of stupid things. Like there are a few little interludes, skit sort of things, that are basically just a guy beatboxing and rapping outside, alone, with no music, and nobody paying attention to them, like a loser. It's endearing. Garian, a group that makes sure to rap entirely in Korean, which does not seem super common. Simply put, they have that sort of dusty vinyl groove and thumpy rhythm section that's very reminiscent of some of the best Western rap of the 90s. Even though Garian's first album is from 2004, specifically, that album often reminds me of Low End Theory, with how Garian leads with the bass and holds up this overall rough texture, but utilizes a lot of range and sensitivity within that. And if your album ever reminds me of Low End Theory, then you're doing something right. Hats off to you. So I'd very strongly recommend Garian and their 2 albums. 2 albums? They only have 2 albums? What the hell? It's been 20 years! Langley, another one of my favorites here. With her first record, she's someone who at first glance you'd think is a by-the-numbers folk artist. And not that it's average quality, she's great right from the get-go, and on some days this is my favorite album of hers. But there's just not a clear X factor to her first songs that stand out and you could bring up easily when describing the album to hook people in, especially when the lyrics aren't a factor. Really, it's just stripped down but well cared for bedroom folk songs. And they're really, really good. With her follow-up records, there's a bit more to go into. In addition to just expanding her general range, she noticeably shifts her focus a little bit away from the guitar and more towards vocals, and how they can be used to fill out a song beyond the obvious. Like there's a track on the second record where otherwise sparse instrumentation is filled out by separate runs of vocals being used in a kind of a cappella way, where they're percussive or gentle or melodic, all without actually saying words. The goal is merely for them to be musical. She explores that idea a bit more on her third album, along with stuff like having a whole choir of backing vocalists in the song, or having a bit of spoken word here and there. Just toying with different ways of having vocals be even more out in front, as if she only learned the guitar in the first place so that she could eventually get to the point of writing songs without it. No idea if that's where she's heading, but I'll be there regardless. Her evolution going from a pretty traditional acoustic singer-songwriter to adding in bits and pieces of that over time, that interests me a lot more than if she were mainly just building out her backing band with each album to get bigger and bigger. Her career is still young, and I look forward to where it goes next. Okay, so adding in here later, She just put out a new single at the start of July, which is 12 minutes long, consisting of 2 vocal tracks where her voices kind of weave in and out of each other along the way. And that's it. For the whole 12 minutes, there are no instrumentals. And I had seen before that she's also recently been doing more spoken word, which is kind of lost on me, obviously, but this song even more so definitely settles that, yeah, this is the sort of direction she's heading in. Cool. Roller Coaster. Excellent mix of that bouncy, danceable acid jazz, the sort of Persona 5 thing where the strings go, that immediately energizing sort of sound, with also songs of this very intimate coffee house vibe that they capture just as well. Like the song One Day off a 2000 album is smooth as can be and mixed perfectly. Like you can practically feel the singer breathing on your ear. So good. This is one of the first records here that I got into. It's smooth, it's cool, it's consistent, and it's got style. Thumbs up. Classiquai is one with some crossover there because one of the 2 main sides of them is also that coffee house sound. Like look, they got a guy playing the bongos at the show. They got the vibe. Overall though, they range from coffee house music to just house music. And I think they're both cool. Sisters Barbershop, another one mentioned earlier. In my head, they're like a rock band wrapped up in a blanket. Like it's not soft rock, but they have all the ingredients to a normal rock band, and it just somehow ends up having this very flimsy, gentle texture instead. The production lays this chill veneer over it all, which is something I noticed more from one track where they actively contrast that. The opening song of their 2008 album is revolving around this thin, meditative guitar strumming. Calming vocals are paired with it, and there's some brushwork in the chorus, but still very stripped down, very low-key. But then after like 4 minutes, someone's messing around more on the drum set. Like the guy was late to rehearsal and is warming up before joining in on the song. And once he does that and starts playing a standard beat, it's presented as is and ends up feeling so sonically out of place. The bass drum and snare rim hits are so harsh compared to the other sounds and overwhelm everything else until the track can't take it anymore and cuts itself off. So on every other song of theirs, it's like, they should sound like that, but instead they actively make these pieces sound lighter and fit together in a more comforting way. There aren't many bands I know that feel quite like them, and they're at their best on their 2008 record as well as their 1998 record. Honestly, I can barely find evidence that the Mustangs exist outside of their Bandcamp page. Like, look at this blurry-ass photo. Like, I have nothing to work with for this segment. I may as well, like, here. This is them. There's an avant-gardeness to the Mustangs with their loose, structureless instrumentals and the fact that the vocals, generally speaking, refuse to resemble that of a normal human being. But it works. They pull off this alien theatricality, especially when a song actually takes a moment to settle into a rhythm for a bit. In those cases, they veer towards a more aggressive version of that Sanullim can vibe that I mentioned before. Solid stuff. The Black Skirts. In reality, a one-man band for a guy who was born in South Korea, then lived in the US for his teenage years and some of his young adulthood, before going back to Korea and starting this project. So being fluent in both English and Korean, he can go back and forth between them from song to song sometimes, and his general style wouldn't be out of place at all on an American indie station, or even beyond that. A song like Stand Still off his first album is such an earworm that I could see a universe where it's a legitimate hit. Like, not just an indie hit, a full-on, normal hit song.
You don't have to dance to a drum machine. You don't have to dance at all. Come on, baby, stand still, you're making it worse. The flames are getting tall.
If he really wanted to, he could completely lock in on slick, upbeat pop rock like that. But as is, on that first record, he's mixing in some other stuff, like some Beach Boys-ish wavy harmonies on Antifreeze. And overall, I think he tends to go towards a Beatles-ish style, with these mid-tempo, catchy songs that are artsy in some aspects, but still have a little playfulness to them. Just rock-solid stuff. No complaints with any of his albums. The. Though not the. This the is not to be confused with that the. Don't mix them up, because that the formed over there in the year 1978, while this the formed over here in the 90s, making it clear that the is the original. They're the. Now as for this the and their album The Band, fuck this album, The Band, well, it's pretty good, but I really only brought them up so that I could do that bit. Meaningful Stone, I'm pretty sure I only found because someone left a comment recommending her a long time ago, so shout out to you, this guy, you're cool. I was immediately drawn in by how soothing her first record, A Call From My Dream, is. It's easy going with these leisurely strums, and it all feels intimate and floaty. Like half the songs aren't grounded by a driving drum beat, you know? They just float around. And those cases are my favorite. Like I could listen to the song Nameless forever. So she has these catchy, bubbly pop songs like Treasure Hunt and Beep Boop, but also stuff where legitimately beautiful is the first word I'd use to describe them. Like As If is a song that only contains a piano and her voice, but completely avoids having that empty space and coolness and loneliness that you often get with that musical pairing. Instead, it somehow manages to keep this warmth and comfort that's ever present throughout the whole record. Beautiful. She put out an EP later with some songs going in a bit more of a 90s rock direction, and effectively so, but then one of her latest singles leans back towards the first album, so I don't know where she's gonna go with her next big release, but I'd keep an eye on her. She's someone who does have some sort of X factor to her. Lee So-ra. She does a lot of stuff, but a good chunk of the time she's kinda like if you combined classy ballroom singer-songwriter stuff with the soundtrack to a K-drama. Which on paper maybe isn't a glowing description, but it actually is. She's one of the best vocalists here, and I like that even when the songs start sullen and get bigger, louder, and build out, it doesn't just become a straight rock ballad, it more so just changes from a classy jazz bar to a classy orchestral theater. It all still feels fancy, you know? Her 2004 and 1996 albums I really like. IU. I like her. Seisumi. Light, spacey surf rock filtered through a very eyes constantly looking down level of timidness, especially in the singer's fairly monotone voice that borders on mumbling as she sings songs with titles like Sorry That I'm Drunk and I Know I'm Kind of Boring. Just a very small, endearing mood that gets refined more as her albums mellow out further. Especially with some other element of the singer's voice, I think you could compare them to like a sadder version of the Beths, which is pretty cool. Third Line Butterfly, and specifically their album Dream Talk, I would say is one of the easiest recommendations for a Western rock fan. They sing in English decently often, and the vocalist does so with a kinda Chrissy Hind-esque sneer, where even when she sings in Korean, the personality gets across. Plus the guitars sometimes adopt that sort of angular tone, very reminiscent of 80s new wave and punk. So there's familiar connections here, but not strictly that. A lot of this record is slow or mid-tempo, and what stands out there is how well they work with the open space in the song, letting notes and strums so often ring out, and these little odds and ends linger on, living in a track like it's its own ecosystem. It all feels more atmospheric. I mean, they do have one track here that's legitimately 4 minutes of the sound of waves on the shore and gusts of wind. So, yeah, I guess that fits. They just come off as effortlessly cool too, from just their songs. Like in my head, they exclusively play their music while wearing sunglasses. The visuals on screen right now cannot change my mind. So that's about as strong of a recommendation as you're going to find here. Chu-ja Chagis, if that's how you say it, I don't know. I know that whenever it's shown up in movies or documentaries or whatever, I'm pretty drawn towards and curious about a lot of the old traditional sounds and music from countries like Korea and China. One of which being when the vocals feel almost constantly strained. They have such heavy vibrato where it almost feels like the vocalist is shaking as they sing. But of course, being such old styles, they were commonly used before the age of the album and since then have been pretty phased out. Like what DNA there is of it in Trot or whatever is pretty tempered down, if I'm even correct in seeing a connection there at all. They just aren't being adapted into modern songs much as far as I know. So I was happy to find an exception to that in Chu-ja Chagis. Those vocal aspects blend surprisingly well with these kinda cosmic, progressive instrumentals, which can have bits of old influence too, especially in some of the tribal percussion sounds. Those eccentricities, like the bells that the singer is often jangling, have connections to traditional shaman styles. But still, the overall makeup of the band is modern, the production is clean, the guitars have slick psychedelic vibes, some rhythms are just demanding to be danced to, and other times it all just kinda rocks.
우리의 차지 우리의 차지 모두의 차지 모두의 차지
The group apparently referred to their sound as funk gut, this open bridge between these two disparate ends, which wasn't an easy fit, but they eventually managed. They're a band that feels like they could only exist right now, and that makes me glad I'm here. And then there's also Deli Spice, there's Muki Muki Manmansu, Minwi Lee, Autumn Vacation, Luli Lee, Elephant, Esens, The Volunteers, Suruhuran, The Wrens, The Bare Naked. Okay, yeah, that's all I got for now. I guess I can end this. Too long didn't watch. Here's just 12 album recommendations. Music's cool. See you later.